in. So Justin, just admit folks as they trickle in.
Yep.
Right. Okay.
You got it, Eric.
All right. Perfect. All right. So hi everybody. My name is Eric. I'm one of the organizers of the AppliedAI Meetup, and your host for this evening. The other organizers are Jen, who's not able to join us today. Then there's Daniel and Justin. So before Tyler's presentation this evening, I'll go through a few items, and then we'll get on to Tyler's presentation. First, I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us this evening. We appreciate it. If you're new to this meetup, I would like to extend a very warm welcome to you, and thank you for joining us. If you've joined us in the past, thank you and welcome. So our meetups are always on the first Thursday of every month. So the next meetup is on October 1st, and the topic then is going to be societal values in the machine learning age. Our presenter will be Professor Wu, and Professor Wu will touch on, how to make machine learning better aligned with societal values such as fairness and privacy. He'll discuss how to make machine learning methods more reliable and robust, especially when those algorithms are interacting in social and economic dynamics. So, because even when developed without malice, we know that algorithms have the potential to treat some people unfairly and to violate some people's privacy. So please join us on October 1st. Also, please share, so help us spread the word. In the August meetup, so the meetup last month, we had Nick from U of M. He presented on medical image analysis with AI. It's a really exciting topic. So if you missed it, there is a YouTube link on today's event page on Meetup. So just go to the event page for today's event and scroll all the way down in the event description. You'll find a YouTube link there. We have an AI podcast called Conversations on Applied AI. This podcast is hosted by Justin. I think I checked today, and I think we have eight episodes posted, and a couple that are in the editing stage. So please give it a listen and leave a positive review when you get a chance. There is a link on today's event description as well. Okay, all right. So, so one other thing I want to touch on today is the Iot Hack Day. As some of you know, every October we have an annual Hack Day. So this is a tradition that goes way back since 2014. So we've done 6 of these Iot Hack Days. So for those not familiar with our Hack Day, we usually get 10 to 15 rooms together in a giant room to build connected devices. The day runs from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. At 8 p.m., the teams pitch, and most importantly, they demo what they built. So then the winning teams are selected by judges and the voting public. So at 8 p.m., we let in the general public, and they get to vote on who they think should win. So obviously, because of COVID, we're doing things differently this year. We'll still be hacking, but virtually. And for this year, we have 2 tracks. We have what we call a project track and a learning track. For the project track, a team will build over 2 weeks a connected device to solve a predefined problem, such as generating a grocery list from items one is throwing into a trash can. So this is typical of what a hack day or hackathon is. So this project we view it as an excellent opportunity to build for fun, to bring an idea to life. And if you've been working on a project, but it's been going so slow, you've wanted to shelve it, this is a chance to jumpstart it and advance the project. And while it's okay to hack alone, our preference is that you hack as part of a team. So, make some new connections. So onto the learning track. So this is something new that we're experimenting with this year. So, for the people that are going to be doing this year, they're going to be guinea pigs, for lack of a better word. And this track is for those who are new to hacking, they don't have a project, or they're not in a team. And how we came about this project is, because of COVID, we think, responsible people are going to be wearing masks to, into the foreseeable future to protect themselves and to protect others. So in this hands-on workshop, we're going to explore TensorFlow and how it can be used to detect whether one is wearing a face mask. So this workshop it's structured into 2 lectures, complemented by self-directed learning. We're hoping that folks are gonna learn something and then, run with it. So in the first week, we'll set up TensorFlow, and then we'll use a pre-trained model for image classification. Then the following week, we'll train the model to detect whether a person is wearing a mask or not. So Chris is, one of the members of our meetup. He's gonna be leading, and he's actually gonna be the instructor for these workshops. So we'll be rolling out more details soon, as in a couple of days. So, watch out for that. So now on to the presenter for this evening. Our presenter is Tyler Nigan. He's a PhD candidate in land and atmospheric science at the Department of Soil, Water, and Climate at the U of M. His research focuses on sustainable agriculture. Tyler is also a co-founder and the CTO of a startup called Insight Sensing. So they use remote sensing tools to estimate plant biomass at the different growth stages. They then take that data and transform it into information, into actionable insights that complement a farmer's experience or intuition. So the farmers have an idea of what they need to do when they see, certain things in their fields. So they know what to do, but this is, using AI, actionable insights can be derived that can complement or help the farmer make even better real-time decisions. So these practical insights can be, on a couple of things. For example, it can be the right combination of fertilizers that can be used to promote crop vibrancy. It can also be on the right time to apply fertilizers. It can be on the right rate to apply, or on the right areas to apply this fertilizer. So, just researching what Tyler's been doing, I found out there's a phrase for what this is. It's called nutrient stewardship. So to Tyler, sustainable agriculture should be profitable agriculture. Tyler grew up on a farm in Wisconsin. His parents still own the farm, talking 900 acres of corn. I grew up in Africa, we say maize. So they grow soybean, wheat, and dairy. So a bunch of cows that produce milk. So farming is in his blood. One thing I would say is, Tyler is one of the, lucky few that can say, I'm actually doing, what I went to school for, Few of us can say, I went to school for this, and that's exactly what I'm doing for a living. So Tyler can say that. So Tyler will be taking questions at the end of his presentation. So please ready your questions as he presents. So without much further ado, I'd like to present Tyler. So Tyler, take it away.
All right. I believe I'll be able to just.
Yeah.
Okay, is my screen showing right now? Do I have to do anything?
Not yet.
Okay, I think I figured it out here.
Okay. Perfect. We got it.
Okay. Can you tell me, is it just the PowerPoint software showing right now, or is the presentation going?
So it's all right. Yep. So the presentation is going. Yeah.
Okay, great.
So you want to click on the display setting. Click on the display settings at the top, and then and then swap presenter view.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
Does that look good?
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, great. My name is Tyler Nigan, and I'd like to first thank Eric and the organizers for this opportunity to be able to kind of share what I'm doing in agriculture and artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the technologies that go along with that to help with agriculture. Yeah, I mean, Eric introduced me. Thanks for the great introduction. And I wouldn't necessarily say I'm doing exactly what I went to school for. First off, it's one of these things that, you don't really know what's out there until you're exposed to it. And so what I thought I would be doing 10 years ago when I started college is much different than what I'm actually doing now, although it's still in this agricultural industry, which I'm really fortunate for that. And I'll also say, I mean, if there are questions during the presentation, I'm okay answering them as they come up. Okay, I've got the presentation here kind of split into 3 parts. I'll start off with an introduction of my background and show some photos of my farm in Wisconsin, and then get into some of the more technical information, probably what you're more interested in this meetup with AI and the research and the applications that I'm working on in both the University of Minnesota as well as with Insight Sensing, this startup that I co-founded. And then we'll finish with some of the just challenges and opportunities and kind of try to just tie up what all this means in agriculture. So first, here's an aerial photo of my farm in Greenwood, my parents' farm. So they still milk cows and own and operate it. It's a rather diverse farm, which is becoming more and more difficult to come by these days with the lower margin or tighter margins and things like that with milk, grain crops, and things like that. The farms across the Midwest are just generally consolidating, becoming much more specialized and much larger. So I'm really fortunate to be able to go back home and, be on a dairy farm where we sell sweet corn. My brother sells pumpkins. We have a vegetable stand that we operate, and we also make maple syrup and things like that. I also just wanted to share kind of an unfortunate event from last fall. We had a tornado come through, and this was on September 24th. So this is a photo from a drone the very next day after, and you can see the silos all came down and fell on the barn. But this was obviously a really unfortunate event, but in the rural community that I'm from, it was really enlightening, I guess, after a few days went by to see all of the people come together to help us pick up the mess and, do one thing at a time. And we're still doing some things now we're always picking up trash anytime we're there, but everything is rebuilt and things are moving along. And so these are some photos from this summer that my sister-in-law took. Okay, and so here's this is the general area, or Greenwood, Wisconsin, where my parents' farm is and where I grew up. And I kind of I went to, when it was time to go to college, I decided to go for soil science. I really enjoy agriculture, but I am not passionate about cows, and so the dairy science part of it really wasn't in the cards for me. So I went to the University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point in soil science, and really had a strong interest in soil fertility and environmental science and conservation and water and nutrient management. And it came time to look for graduate programs, and I was fortunate to have an opportunity at the University of Minnesota where there's a project where they were looking for a master's student to do research on in potatoes for nitrogen and water management using aerial imagery. And so that was kind of the perfect combination of my interests and what kind of led me over here. And after my master's, I worked in the industry for a few years, first selling seed as an agronomist, and then for a couple of years working for a startup company called Farm Intelligence. They're based in Mankato. And this was in 2013, kind of right when drones became commercially available for, at a decent cost. And so we were generally just trying to take all this data, all these images collected from drones and turn it into information. That was 7 years ago, and I would say I'm still trying to do the same thing. So I don't think there's any really good solutions out there, although we're getting closer, I think, in every project that's done and every technology that's commercialized, but there is a lot of work to be done here. So leading into my PhD, I decided to come back because, believe it or not, I didn't know any programming, and I was working for a startup software company. And so I thought, well, there's a whole nother world out here, and I don't really know, a bit of programming. So one of my main goals in doing the PhD, other than the research itself and to gain a deeper understanding of the science, was to learn programming as a skill, because I just kind of see this place where, to be able to bring the technology, bring the science to the practitioners, in this case, farmers and agronomists, I think that is a crucial piece to be able to, understand how software is built and at least have a little bit of skills in there. So in my dissertation research, I'm looking at precision nitrogen management in corn, and I'm especially focusing on quality control aspects. So anywhere from data collection to the processing, model building, the machine learning, and then the analysis and what that means. And I'll get into that a little bit later. And so this is kind of just a workflow of kind of what a lot of people in AI kind of go through. You go to capture the data, and then all the processing tasks, and then the training tasks, and then try to predict something for the practitioner. And I don't know, I'm curious to know, I guess, in other industries and such, if people doing the research, or if you're commercializing something or working in industry, if you're involved in every step along this way. Because I would say in agriculture, for the most part, at least any of the projects I've been a part of, it's so, I would say it's immature in its development and the use of these technologies, that we're kind of, we have our hands on every one of these pieces, which becomes overwhelming at times. So then about a year ago, another graduate student at the U and myself, Brian Bowman, and he's a PhD candidate in water resources sciences, we co-founded a company, Insight Sensing, to try to be able to take some of the things we're working on in our projects and commercialize them. And so this is part of a National Science Foundation, STTR, or Small Business Innovation and Research Technology Transfer Grant. And so this is a program that the National Science Foundation puts out to really try to fund, I guess, high-risk ventures where the people are trying to commercialize the technology from their research that they wouldn't otherwise have funding for. And so Brian and I, we became connected because he kind of picked up his PhD project right where my master's project left off, in potatoes. And so a lot of the things we learned from my master's project, he kind of picked up, and we've always been in communication since, and now we're working on this company together. So that's really exciting for us. And just kind of a little bit about what we're doing at Insight Sensing and this whole topic in general. I tried to put my presentation together to have a little bit of a balance between the background in precision agriculture and then the more technical aspects of artificial intelligence and, you know, maybe what you're interested in. I know I'm speaking to a more general audience, and I think there are a lot of aspects of agriculture that you might not be familiar with. So this whole idea is that, you know, we see variability in the fields, and not only over space but also in time. And these things are a culmination of changes in the soil. So the soil can change drastically just with one step. And, you know, when we look at this picture on the left here of soil variability, we see standing water here, and you can see little topography changes, and it's flooded right here, but then the soil, you know, I don't know if you can see my cursor, can you? Okay. So you can see flooding here, but then just not too far away, the soil's already starting to dry out. And all of the chemical and biological phenomena going on under the soil, we know that there's huge differences in these environments, but it's just frankly very difficult to measure the soil. And then put that together with the weather, and we're all familiar with climate change, and especially in the last decade, where it's really starting to hit us more locally or regionally with the extreme rainfall events we're having. And we get this crop variability, and where we are really just trying to manage for this variability, both across space or across the field, but then also across the growing season, or from, you know, May or so when the crop is planted until August or September when management is more or less done before the harvest. And the timing is really important because there's different management interventions that are even, you know, possible depending on the time of the season. So both with the work I've done in research at the University of Minnesota, and then what Brian and I are trying to commercialize now, is all related to this phenomenon and this problem. And there's a wide recognition that farmers need management tools that have fast turnover, or they provide rapid and reliable information. They account for the spatial and temporal variability, presented in a way that makes sense to them, that they can take action on, and then can mitigate their risk, and so they can get a profit. So how does AI fit into all this, and applied AI? And so this gets into the second part of the presentation here, where I'm going to touch on some of the current research. I've got several different examples of how not only myself but other students have worked on this topic in agriculture. So the first one is a rather simple one, and I think this is more or less figured out. I don't know about the accuracy, but stand counts. So we're looking at a corn crop here, and it's relatively early in the season, and we can use remote sensing to go, and a drone to go fly over this field and quantify how many plants came up versus how many didn't come up. And so from the standpoint of the farmer, you know, if the stand isn't high enough, if they don't have enough high enough proportion of plants that emerged, maybe because of wet conditions or cool conditions in the early spring, or some other thing, they might want to know, well, should I replant, or should I go into certain areas of the field and replant? And so here we're just kind of seeing quick and dirty image of a cornfield where we've got bounding boxes around all of the areas that are missing a plant. And so then this can be quantified, and so this uses computer vision techniques to be able to quantify the population. A second example, and these next examples are gonna, I guess, become more technical, and let's see. Yeah, I want to ask, you know, are there any questions at this point? I'm not very familiar with the Zoom. the Zoom layout here. Okay.
Yeah, so nobody has raised any questions yet. So
Okay.
if people raise them, I will let you know, right?
Okay, yeah, I'll expect you to interrupt then, Eric, okay?
Perfect.
Okay, so the second example, potato nitrogen stress. And so like I mentioned earlier, potatoes is where I worked on for my master's program back 2010 to 2012. This is where my co-founder with Insight Sensing, Brian Bowman, he's working for his dissertation project. And this is really where we're focusing our work on Insight Sensing. And what are we looking for? So the problem is nitrogen management. So kind of just starting basic, nitrogen is a fertilizer that potatoes need in pretty high quantities. It severely impacts the yield, the amount of potatoes that the farmer is able to produce. And so it's an important input for a potato farmer. Now, the downside is that if a farmer puts on too much or more nitrogen fertilizer than the crop needs, first, they might be spending, money on that fertilizer that they didn't really need to put on. So there might be some economic issues there. But I guess more importantly for potato, when the nitrogen isn't taken up by the crop, then it leaches into the groundwater and it can be lost in a variety of different ways as a pollutant to the environment. And so we really want to be able to get on top of this, quantify the status of the nitrogen status of the potato crop throughout the season to be able to, we kind of call it spoon feed it or give it a little bit of nitrogen fertilizer at a time, maybe every week or every 10 days or so that we can achieve optimal yield and profit, but not over apply. So how do we do this? And this is based on, kind of what we're seeing here. I'm going to show you some of the data that we have with the aerial imagery. And over here on the right is a picture of this drone, and it's a really pretty sophisticated camera. It's called a hyperspectral camera. And this is specialized because different than, say, like a normal camera that you might have on your cell phone, where it's really sensitive to 3 bands, red, green, and blue. And when those 3 bands are put together, it mimics what the human eye sees. And so we can take a picture and it looks like what we see. Now, this hyperspectral camera is different because it is actually sensitive to 250 bands or specific colors, not just those 3, through the visible and the near infrared part of the spectrum. And so just kind of, it's always a question that comes up, what is the price of this setup? This is a DJI Matrice 600 Pro, which with an extra set of batteries and a gimbal, you can get for around $9,000 or $10,000. And then the camera, this is a Pika 2 hyperspectral camera from Resonon. They're out of Montana. And this, with the whole aerial platform and the computer and everything, is right around $20,000 to $25,000. So the camera is really the specialized piece of equipment here, and really where the cost is as well. And with that said, also where I guess the challenges come with the data collection and the processing to be able to get the data out that we need. So a zoom in on, I guess, the electromagnetic spectrum here we're looking at from 400 to 900 nanometers. So this would be the visible, the blue, green, and red light, and then the near infrared light. So we call it the red edge, and in between the red and the near infrared, we call it the red edge. The reason for this is it drastically changes when we're looking at vegetation. So let me back up here. This graph is looking at the reflectance, or the amount of energy that is reflected off of our target, really that our camera is capturing as a function of the wavelength. And this is the electromagnetic spectrum. So when we're looking at vegetation, so this blue line here, we tend to see in the visible region, we tend to see a higher reflectance in the green. And this is the exact reason that, when we visualize a plant with our own eyes, it appears to be green. It's because there's more green light reflected than either blue or red. And so that's a real, I guess, a physical reason that, why plants are green. Our eyes aren't sensitive to the near infrared region, but if they were, we would only be able to really see the plants in the near infrared, because you see the reflectance is so much higher near infrared than it is in the green. And without having a camera, we would really not be able to quantify this. And so it's really a powerful tool to be able to collect imagery, process it, and then be able to graph something like the soil, which is this green line, versus the vegetation, which is the blue line. And we can now look in a whole nother dimension. Instead of just space, if we have an image that has X and Y dimensions, we have this other dimension of color or reflectance. And over here on the left, we'll see, stark differences between a healthy leaf, a dead leaf, and a stressed leaf. So really what we're trying to do is, when we're in this area of healthy versus stressed, be able to quantify very minute differences based on the reflectance, as well as other information that we have available to us, things like soil, weather information, management information. And so using that together, using a machine learning model to be able to make predictions of nitrogen status. So just briefly, kind of what we're working on at Insight Sensing, because this is related to, we're working on potatoes to start with before getting into any other crops, but really working to be able to provide maps to growers that to potato farmers and their agronomists that show petiole nitrate concentration and how that varies over space in a field. And so what we're seeing here is it's a potato field, and it's only half planted to potatoes. So this is a center pivot. When I say center pivot, I mean it's an irrigation piece of irrigation equipment that the well comes out of the center and goes all the way to the end, and then it just circles radially around the field. And that irrigation obviously provides water, or irrigation water. But potato farmers, they also are able to put their nitrogen fertilizer on in this way. And so, I guess going ahead and bringing all this together, the idea is that when we see variability that we're looking at in this map, in petiole nitrate concentration or nitrogen status of the crop, the farmer, the agronomist, they really want to be able to adjust the rate of the fertilizer at different areas of the field, so they're applying enough to achieve optimal profit, but not putting on too much that might be susceptible to be lost to the environment as a pollutant. And so one other thing I guess I want to bring up on this topic is that Brian and I were really working on meeting the farmer where they are. And what I mean by that is kind of coming to them in their operation and learning how they're managing their crop, and then being able to provide these data layers, these predictions of, like, for example, petiole nitrate concentration that we're looking at here, that they're going to be able to use and understand right away. And this is, I think, a big problem in agriculture. This agricultural industry, when it applies to AI, is that there's a lot of remote sensing data. There's a lot of companies out there that will provide these pretty pictures, so to speak, but they're generally relative, or they might just call them plant health. The fact is, potato growers, or any farmers for that matter, they're used to certain numbers. They're used to certain samples that they're taking and making management decisions on that. In the case with potatoes, these agronomists and farmers, they're going out to the field weekly during the summertime, and they're pulling tissue samples. They are taking the petioles and sending them into a lab to do wet chemistry to get this exact measure, petiole nitrate concentration. And so they're already doing that, and they're very used to these numbers. And I guess what I'm trying to say here is that it's not enough to just provide a pretty picture or even relative nitrogen status. I mean, it might provide some value, but it's really limited because it's almost impossible to know what scale this particular stress might be on. Yeah, you know, is it, even though we're seeing differences, it might all be perfectly healthy, or it might be just so bad that, you know, there's it's an emergency situation. So when it comes to providing these absolute numbers and predictions, that brings in a lot of challenges with machine learning models and being able to properly build them and train them with the data that we have at hand, where it's good enough for the customer. So that was number 2. And so the third example I have here is related to wheat breeding and phenotyping. And then I'll finish off by discussing some of my dissertation research on nitrogen uptake in corn. So moving away from potatoes, and we're getting a little more technical as we move along here, and you'll get to see more of the data here coming up. So this is a picture of my old lab mate at the University of Minnesota. He graduated with his PhD, Dr. Ali Moghimi, and he's at UC Davis now. And so one of his projects was, you know, really using the same equipment, this hyperspectral camera and drone, and he was trying to, his main objective was to predict the grain yield of the wheat crop for breeding purposes. And we're looking at, so these are fields just north of the St. Paul campus of the University of Minnesota. And if you drive down Larpenteur, you can usually see them. And we see all the small plots of wheat here. And these are all different lines. They call them lines, or, you know, maybe varieties, where the geneticists, the plant geneticists are trying out all these different combinations of DNA sequences to get different traits to be able to really provide maximum yield, or, you know, suitable yield. But a lot of these efforts are around disease resistance and drought tolerance, and a lot of things where we can maybe expand the area where these particular crops are growing, or, you know, even if there is a drought, if we have a variety that is more tolerant to drought or a particular disease or something like that, that's advantageous to the farmer, because even when bad things happen, then they can still get decent yields and hopefully earn a profit. So that's kind of the agronomic background on this whole problem. So Ali flew the drone, captured this hyperspectral imagery over these wheat plots. And on the left here, you know, I'll just kind of go through some of the different steps that he took in his project then to eventually make the predictions, the grain predictions. So step 1 would be to, you know, this is after I'll be honest, I am kind of skipping a lot of the steps with the pre-processing and things, which is important, but maybe not for right now. So once we have the imagery pre-processed, and just briefly, that's converted to reflectance and georeference. So every pixel has a latitude, longitude, and a point in space. After we do that, you know, from the research perspective, we got to crop the plots, crop the plot boundaries. So we have really a separate image for every plot, and we're able to identify which pixels belong to which experimental plot. And you know, along with that, you know, there's a lot of field work that has to be done actually measuring the yield in these plots. So this isn't something that Ali did, his collaborators did instead. But then he was given that yield data as his ground truth data then. And on the right here, we're again looking at a plot similar to what I showed for potatoes. This is wavelength, 400 to 900 nanometers and reflectance on the y-axis. And so just for reference, 100% reflectance would mean that all of the light that really, when we're talking outside, all the light energy that was provided by the sun was all reflected back to the camera sensor. And so the absorption of this energy is really the basis of what photosynthesis is. And so in this red region, the plant will tend to absorb a lot of this light energy, and it uses that for photosynthesis. So the lower the reflectance in the red region, right at about 650 nanometers, the lower the reflectance, consequently, the higher the absorption, meaning the more efficient it is at producing chlorophyll via photosynthesis. And so we'll tend to see as the plant becomes more stressed, this the green line is the winter wheat vegetation curve. As the plant becomes more stressed, we'll see a higher reflectance in the red region, meaning that there's less of that energy being absorbed by the plant itself. And now what we're really looking at in this plot is these the end members. End members just mean different objects in the image. And I'll show a close-up of one of the wheat plots in just a moment here. But the whole concept here, it's probably obvious, but each object, whether it's the winter wheat, the reflectance panel, the soil, the shadow that we're seeing, each of these objects has a different reflectance signature, we oftentimes call them. And then that signature is the basis behind, each of these data points along this line would be the feature that we use to make the predictions. And just a term here when we talk about spikes versus leaves, the spikes are the heads of the wheat plant itself, where the grain is growing. And the senescent leaves would be these leaves that are dying. A lot of this imagery was captured right before harvest, when there wasn't really any, there wasn't always all green vegetation. So it was like yellowing or senescent. So Ali did principal component analysis to extract the different end members, or to more or less classify each of these end members in each of his images. So principal component analysis is an unsupervised technique, and just using the first two components, this graph on the left is showing. We're able to really separate out all of these different targets. And what we're really interested in this project are the spikes and the leaves. We're also interested in everything else, but more so just for the purpose to get rid of them, which the segmentation process, which I'll show in a minute. And on the right is, showing kind of the same concept, but with a third dimension, or a third principal component, to be able to separate these features even further, or these end members even further. And I'll also mention this work is all published just this year, Computers and Electronics in Agriculture. So if you're really interested in getting into the nitty-gritty of the methodology and the results, I'll steer you towards that publication. So the next step, segmentation, and this is where we take everything we learned from the end member extraction, that unsupervised classification process, to be able to classify each pixel as largely shadow, soil, leaves, or spikes. And this is again using the hyperspectral imagery. So we have 240 spectral bands available to us to make this classification. And as I mentioned earlier, I show the close-up of one of these wheat plots, and you see, we're not looking at it from straight above, but you can see down through the canopy with high-resolution imagery and see bare soil. And then you'll see there's green vegetation, there's this more yellow vegetation, and then there's the spikes, or the wheat heads. And Ali, what he did is he calculated or quantified the relative abundance of spikes and leaves in a wheat plot. And so this gets into, I would say it's just a perfect example of these issues that we come across in agriculture, and I think every industry probably has them, and this is just a good example in agriculture that really makes it, it's just another roadblock to be able to finally predict yield like we want to. And I guess I should explain what the problem is. The problem is that we get one yield value for the whole plot. It's not a large plot, it's only 4 rows, or about 4 feet wide by about 10 feet long. So it's a rather small plot, but as you can see, there's thousands of pixels here. And there's a lot of spatial variability even within this very, very small plot. And our ground truth is, we've got one ground truth sample. And then part of Ali's research and what one of his major conclusions in this was, I shouldn't say conclusions, but I guess one of his major contributions was the methodology that he used to kind of look at this imagery, this image where, and I'm referring to this image on the right, and the black would be all of these pixels that we don't really want, or they're representing more soil, more shadow, less wheat spikes and leaves. But yeah, it's really on the scale of the abundance of spikes and leaves versus non-spikes and leaves. And this is, again, four wheat plots or wheat rows we're looking at. And this row on the right is showing a substantially more leaves and spikes than any of the other 3 rows. And the 2 outside rows are substantially more than the inside rows. The reason for this is that these outside rows don't have competition from other plants. So they have more access to more nutrients, whereas the middle rows, they're competing with those outer rows and each other to get water, nutrients, things like that. This row on the right side is, it's actually on the south side of the plot. And so in the Minnesota latitudes, the sun is in the southern sky. These plants are getting a lot more light energy than the other plants. And so that's the physical reason behind this. But now Ali's got this problem where, okay, we've got one value for grain yield, and we've got all these pixels, and really he's short on training data. As you know, the more samples we have, the more confident we can be in not overfitting a model and getting better prediction results. And so I don't have a slide on it. Is what Ali did is he kind of he gridded this the plot out into some like 50 sub areas, and he used this layer right here to calculate the proportion of grain yield that, I guess this is an assumption in this project, but this is kind of what we oftentimes have to do, is make assumptions. But he used this layer then to quantify the proportion of that one grain yield value for the whole plot, and he quantified it for each particular area of the plot, just by basically by multiplying this relative abundance by that one plot average grain yield. And so then he used a deep neural network to predict the yield. And really he was we're looking at hundreds and hundreds of points here. He probably had 150 plots or so in this project. But with that method that he used to extrapolate, using the relative abundance, it helped to be able to use this kind of a model. Otherwise, he wouldn't have enough samples, and you'd be required to do this for years and years and years, which is obviously more costly before you get enough samples. So I'm not going to get into the details regarding his methodology, other than just kind of what I showed here. But I will point you again to his publication in Computers and Electronics in Agriculture. If you want to learn more about his methodology there. And so now my fourth example, final example, and this is from my dissertation research predicting in-season corn nitrogen uptake. And here we're just kind of looking at, this is what I used for the graphical abstract in my paper actually, just these main places along the main steps along this process of getting the data all the way to making the predictions. And I'll also just remind you that as soon as we make a prediction, whether it's corn nitrogen uptake or petiole nitrate in potatoes or wheat yield, even though we made a prediction, that doesn't necessarily tell the farmer what to do. And there's some more things to be said about that that I'll get into as we wrap up. But it's worthwhile just to keep that in mind. So I'm going to kind of go through each of these steps, and how it relates to my project. And also, this is work that just got published earlier this spring in remote sensing. And so there's more details there if you're curious to see exactly what was done. So step one, capture the imagery. So we had an experiment down in Waseca, Minnesota. And so this is what we're seeing in this map here. The colors that we're looking at are just different nitrogen rates. So we put on a different nitrogen rate in these different plots. For the purpose of this experiment, we oftentimes have several objectives. And so the one objective I'm focusing on is to be able to predict nitrogen uptake using hyperspectral imagery. So I'm using the same camera that Ali was using. And so we put on different rates of nitrogen fertilizer to more or less induce this difference in nitrogen uptake. And then one of the other objectives was to look at the yield at the end of the season to see, okay, how did, in 2019, this was an experiment from last year, how did the weather and the environment and the soils all kind of come together to bring the yield or to produce the grain yield that we saw. So step one, capture the imagery, and we went out into the field and took these corn tissue samples, dried them down, weighed them, sent them to the lab to get wet chemistry done on them for nitrogen concentration. And then with that, we were able to calculate nitrogen uptake, which was our ground truth sample, what we're really trying to predict. And there's a shot of the camera and the drone again. So step two, the processing the imagery. Now I got into maybe a little of this with Ali's project, but I'll go another step further. And before I do though, I'll also just mention that step one here, or step A, or whatever you want to call it, in this processing cycle, it's already pre-processed imagery. So we've already converted to reflectance. We've already done the georeferencing, which can be a tedious task, to say the least. So we're picking up from there. And so what we're looking at here is an aerial image of a cornfield. And in this field, there's different plots. So 101, 102, 201, 202, 301, 302. And so first step, I guess before I go through this, I'm going to mention a lot of the tools. So I actually developed a Python package called HS Process for helping to do this. It's just kind of a result of trying to use software that is available and not being able to do exactly what I want to do. Especially relating to the cropping part of it, cropping out each image or each plot from the image autonomously or automatically, I guess, or programmatically. There's always tools out there to do this stuff manual, but you're literally sitting there for weeks at a time getting through all of your plots. And then when you want to retry something or do something different because you realize you messed up on step one, if you're 5 steps through the process, you got to do them all over again. And so I was just not really satisfied with what was out there, open source tools, as well as some of the other software tools that are, that are like subscription based or something like that. So this is kind of like the different features of this HS process. So the first is to crop it. And so having a shapefile or a polygon layer of the plot boundaries, we more or less just overlap that with the image to get a cropped image representing that plot. And so if we have 50 plots in our field, at the end of this process, now instead of one large image or whatever it might be, we have 50 small images that have some certainty that those pixels only are representing the plot we're interested in. It might seem like a simple thing, but it's really not, and it can cause a lot of headaches, I think, especially when you're doing small plot research and things like that. So the next step would be to smooth the spectra. So when we just look at one pixel and look at the pixel values across the electromagnetic spectrum from 400 to 900 nanometers, look at the blue line here before spectral smoothing, we see a lot of noise. And this is just because, the signal to noise ratio of a camera sensor is only so good. It's just something we have to deal with. And I mean, maybe someday these sensors will get better. But right now we see a lot of this noise. So it's essential to smooth that line out before we do anything else, because otherwise, imagine just using, imagine, each of these points that make up this line is a feature that goes into our machine learning model. And so if we have that noise present, that's just gonna show up in our model and make our model less accurate. So spectrally smooth each pixel. The next step, segmentation. So this is similar to what Ali did with his principal component analysis. I use a different method, just using, it's a spectral index called M-carry2. The details don't really matter, other than it just uses a combination of wavelengths. And that particular combination of wavelengths is really good at separating out vegetation from non-vegetation. And so the higher the M-carry2 value, the more likely it is to be vegetation. So I just chose a threshold kind of based on a guess and check, and we segmented. So this is the image we started with, and we segmented the soil and the shadow out, and we're left with just the vegetation. This is a major advantage of using imagery, as opposed to, and I'll compare it to a sensor that might be put on a tractor or a center pivot irrigator that might just take one point at a time. The imagery allows us to really look at X and Y and segment out vegetation from shadow and soil, which really is a big deal, I think, in building a more accurate model. And so then the next step, taking this plot with only the vegetation and then convert it to a spectra. And so this is what I showed in that plot from Ali's wheat project. And this is representing a corn plant at a pretty early stage. Again, reflectance is a function of wavelength. And this is then ultimately the points that make up this line are the features that go into our machine learning model. So I feel like I just cruise right through this processing. I know you probably don't think that, but the processing really is a big step. And it's another area of research that I'm working on. When we change, my question is, when we change one thing along that line, so those were six steps of the processing, the post-processing. In each step, I really had to make a decision. Should I do this or that? This or that? And so one of the analyses I'm working on now is to actually use, with the help of the Minnesota Supercomputing Institute and HS process to program all this out, really look at how does that decision to do one processing route versus another affect our final model. And so I'm working on getting automating everything from the image processing to the training, the hyperparameter tuning, the cross-validation and testing of the model to be able to try like 300 or 400 different scenarios and compare them. This is just another image of that segmentation step from some, I guess, larger areas of the field, and then the histograms of the result. And so this is a little blurry, but it's corn. You can see the soil, you can see the vegetation before segmentation and then after segmentation. So after segmentation, we're just left with the green pixels, and then the histogram is just showing the distribution of those pixels from this mcarry2 index. Again, this was the index that was used to separate. It's good at separating out between soil and vegetation. And from the first column, or D, over to E and F, we're looking at different growth stages of the corn. So V6 is when the corn is between ankle and knee high. V8 is right around knee high. And V14 is close to head high. Just to give you kind of an idea what these growth stages mean. So step 3 in this whole process. So after all the image processing, which again is, it can get really tedious, but I think it's the place that is worth the time to spend, because I think it does have a lot of a lot of impact on our final model results. But step 3, train the models. And this is, I'm going to include feature selection, hyperparameter tuning, testing, and cross-validation as part of this. So first, the feature selection. So as I mentioned, I've got like 240 spectral bands, very precise areas of the spectrum. And the feature selection is more or less, I use the lasso model to be able to use with the training set of the data that I had, and identify these wavelengths that had the most impact on the model. And in this case, what we're looking at here is wavelength on our x-axis, and then the number of features that the lasso model selected on the y-axis. So, and then this is just kind of the reflectance curve, or a relative reflectance curve of vegetation, just for reference, because the red edge region is oftentimes a really important region. And so really, when we're trying to train a model, we want a simple model. We don't want to use all 240, spectral bands. We'd rather use just like 5 or 6 of them that are just really good. And so that's what we're highlighting down here. This particular, this model showed that I think it was right at like 728 and 732 nanometers, as well as like 860 nanometers used for the model. The next part of the training would be the hyperparameter tuning. Now I kind of skipped over the details on what was actually done in what I'm actually showing here. What we're showing here are, I looked at 4 different models: the lasso model, support vector machine, random forest, and partial least squares. And these are all regression models, by the way. I'm trying to predict nitrogen uptake in percent. And so using regression models to do this. And so for each of these 4 models, we're looking at the error rate versus the number of features that was used. And then the different colors, the teal color versus the dark blue colors, I would just, I guess, ignore that now. Those were just different methods. Again, I always kind of, I always get curious about, okay, what happens if I do, this versus that? And so I would, I guess let's just ignore that for now. But we're seeing is, this is pretty common. As we increase the number of features, the error rate goes down, but we get a plateau usually. And so then there's this decision that has to be made, this balance. Okay, at what point do we sacrifice accuracy for simplicity? You know, the more simple models are better generally, or easier to use with, so they're more desirable, but we also want accuracy. The biggest thing to take away from here was just, you know, for me was looking at the random forest model, how I think because of its large number of hyperparameters that have to be tuned, I think this is probably a reason why the random forest model didn't do quite as well as the others, but that's not much more than a guess. But the other three models generally performed similar. And this is, again, just looking at our test set, or excuse me, this is only using the training set, not the test set. Okay, so this is the training and the test set. So the teal would be the training set, the purple or color is the validation set, or the test set. And where these overlap well or really close means that the models weren't really overfit. Where there's more of a difference, especially we see in the random forest, this is showing that the training error rate was much lower than the validation error rate, signifying that our random forest model was generally overfit quite a bit, which is not ideal. And so the other three models worked well. So again, this kind of shows that lasso, support vector machine, and partially squares regression all kind of perform relatively similar, really. And so for me, like when someone asks, okay, well, what model do you recommend? Frankly, in this case, it is either lasso or partially squares regression, just because the hyperparameter tuning is just so much simpler. Lasso only has one hyperparameter, the alpha value that has to be tuned, and PLS has just a couple. Support vector machine has a lot, and so just looking at the computation time to tune these models, support vector machine was on the order of hundreds the time longer than lasso or PLS. And finally, some of the prediction results. You know, this, so we're looking at measured on the y-axis versus the predicted for, again, each of these four models. And we kind of have, with the different colors and the different shapes, the different, I guess, image quality, we might say. So by that, I mean the gray means we had finer pixel resolution. The cyan color, we had a coarser pixel resolution. I'm not going to get too much into that. That was just another objective of this particular project. And then the different shapes are the different growth stages. And so the biggest thing that came out of this research, and what really, one of the things that made me most excited, is to be able to use kind of a general model that works across growth stages from V6, which is in between ankle and knee-high corn, as I said, to V14, which is, you know, taller than I stand, and use the same model, and we still have pretty good accuracy, you know, throughout. So the R-square, this would be the best fit line, is 0.87, and the prediction error, where mean absolute error, is right around 10, and this is in units of kilograms per hectare. And you'll see, I guess, the mean nitrogen uptake is 100 kilograms per hectare, so we're talking about a 10% error on a relative basis. So then, you know, that's the AI part of it, right? You know, that's the training the model, doing all the image processing, testing, making some model. So the real question that any farmer is interested in, they're trying to answer this question: how much fertilizer do I apply? Unfortunately, we don't have that figured out yet. Yeah, we can predict nitrogen uptake, and I just described, you know, how we're able to do that successfully. But what we don't know is crop nitrogen demand, and we might know this on average over the years for a particular field, but the weather happens, the soil is different. when we go from one area of the field to the next, there's interactions with the biological activity and the physical soil attributes and the chemical soil attributes that really change this from one day to the next, and also from year to year. And this is a big area that I think deserves another, also I think AI can be applied to put, weather stations, hyper-localized weather stations. So sensors like soil temperature, soil moisture in specific areas of the field, to be able to help make predictions about of like soil nitrogen availability as we move across the season. So if we had a model just like I have of crop nitrogen uptake, we have a model also for soil available nitrogen. When I say available nitrogen, I mean that nitrogen that's available to the plant. That's really the key piece to be able to put this together. So we're making progress, but there's still lots of work to be done. And just to wrap up here, I guess, let's see, I guess in putting all this in perspective, these different use cases that I showed, I kind of look at digital agriculture versus precision agriculture as a good question. Digital agriculture, I kind of think of as, okay, we're collecting this data and digitizing it, and we can store it on a computer, but it doesn't necessarily, and it might mean IoT and being able to share data and use it in certain models, but it doesn't necessarily tell us what to do. And that's what I think of with precision agriculture. It includes more of a management aspect to it. Another thing to keep in mind that I just want to say in this whole thing is that I think it's important not to underestimate this importance of establishing a balance among three things: the economic, the environmental, and the social ecosystems that are influenced by agriculture. What I mean by that is there's these three worlds, really. I think, like when we're talking about agriculture, especially with nitrogen pollution. The economic, that's the farmer having to make money because he's trying to earn a living. The environmental, because it's an unintended consequence that when fertilizer, nitrogen, phosphorus fertilizer are applied, and we do farming, there's this environmental cost to that, that are perhaps degrading our natural resources in certain ways. And then there's this social aspect, and that's what do we value these other two things at? And I can have an answer for what I value the economics of agriculture, and you can have an answer that's probably going to be different for economic. Same goes for environmental. But we all have to come together at the table together to be able to talk to these things, to talk about these things, to really solve them, to make any progress. And finally, artificial intelligence is only a tool, and we have to treat it as a tool. It's not gonna, I don't think, ever solve all of our problems. There's always going to be this human aspect, and that's kind of what I mean about balancing these three worlds here. And so, I think I'm just going to kind of wrap up here. I was just going to get more in depth into some challenges, I guess, with doing that, but I see the time. I've already been going for about an hour. I think we'll stop it here. I was just going to get into more detail about precision agriculture, digital agriculture, but we'll skip over that. So again, I would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to present. Yeah. And I don't know if there's any questions. I'm happy to answer some questions, though.
Yeah. Hey, Tyler, thank you for the presentation. That was super interesting. We do have a question in the chat here. So the question is, how does the model generalize to other regions of USA, Canada, or the world?
So the input data, I think we're talking about the nitrogen uptake in corn. So the input data came from Waseca, Minnesota. There were 2 years from there, 2018 and 2019, and Wells, Minnesota, which is only like 20 miles south of Waseca. So I can't answer that question, but I will tell you the different things that are at play here. So first of all, we only had 2 growing seasons, 2018, 2019. We were actually looking at 2 different corn hybrids. The hybrid would be the genetics of the corn, and that makes a big deal because the shape of the plant, the color of the plant changed from one hybrid to the other. And so we weren't just looking at one hybrid, we were at least looking at 2, but there are hundreds of hybrids. When we're talking around the world, there are thousands and thousands of hybrids. So this model is rather specific, I would say, to Minnesota. Now, I think it would probably do okay in the Midwest, in the Corn Belt of the US. But I also expect it to become overfit the further away we get from southern Minnesota because of a combination of the plants, the climate, and the soils.
All right. So Michael, did that answer your question?
That one wasn't my question.
Okay.
Oh, I'm different, Michael. Sorry, never mind.
Oh yeah, Michael.
Yes.
Larionov. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we have another question from another Michael.
Okay.
So how have farmers responded to this insight? Have you had customers take any direct action, such as increase fertilization in specific areas in response to your map visualizations? If so, what results have you seen?
So this is an early stage. So no is the answer, but let me explain this. I would say in the last 10 to 15 years, especially once the drone became consumer grade, 2012, 2013, there were a lot of overpromises in precision agriculture related to, okay, we got this tool, it's going to solve everything, and you pay me $10 an acre, I will provide you this map. And there's a lot of overpromising and under-delivering. So now we're kind of fighting that stigma against this AI in agriculture from the farmers, from the practitioners. Frankly, they don't really trust any map that someone else gives them. And there's this effort now that we have to overcome that mistrust because of things that have happened in the past. With that said, to be able to bring something, technology transfer, take the research and apply it to a farmer's field, that's no small task. And so Brian and I in Insight Sensing, we're working on really working on building our product to have some sense of scale. So the proof of concept is there. We know that it works, but we know that we're not going to have a person in the field every day or even every week to collect this data. So we have to rely on satellite imagery. And so when our models take in as features drone data or handheld data, that is still reflectance. It's the same kind of data, but it's not. It's from a different sensor. I always say all sensors are not created equally. And so the features are different. And so when the features are fundamentally different than our models, it's going to have some effect on our models. So Brian and I are working on scaling, this to be able to train these models in a more automatic way based on anytime there's new data coming in from either the customer or satellite imagery or weather or things like that. And so the answer to this is, we haven't really gotten a whole lot of feedback from farmers is because we're too early of a stage. They like what they see in the research, but they haven't seen it on their own farm, if that makes sense. They they know their farm, they don't know the research farm or the research field. And so that's a big step. And we're working with a potato farmer. We were working with them this summer to be able to do just this. They're really busy right now. So the way the agriculture environment works is that you meet in the wintertime, you work in the summertime. So we'll get everything together and meet up with them, try to get more farmers for next year to continually kind of get the feedback from them. But generally, the mock-ups and what we have on our research plots that is predicting either petroleum nitrate or nitrogen uptake, the nitrogen status, they're really excited about that. Again, I think the reason because they're used to seeing a relative map, something that is not in the units that they're used to working with. And really what we're trying to do is take that next step of meeting the farmer where they are, using the units that they already use. And then there's some benefits for us with that as well, for getting new training data, because they're already taking these tissue samples.
Yep, we have another question that it's actually like a lead from what you just touched on. How are you able to convince farmers to share their data when many of them feel it's proprietary information that makes them unique and competitive?
Yeah, this is another roadblock that, obviously a good question, and something that I don't think the past decade has done any favors to, the industry, because I think farmers especially, they've seen from certain companies aggregate the data, and the ultimate fear is that it gets used against them, and not even among competitors. I think competitors in the same space of using AI to help the farmer make agronomic decisions and things is great, but what farmers don't like, and for good reason, is when a company gets a hold of the data and is also selling a product, say fertilizer or seed, and prices that product based on the data that the farmer owns. If product pricing is, whether it's seed or fertilizer or something else, if that's coming in, if that decision is made based on the farmer's data, farmers generally look at that as misuse of data, stealing data. And it's obviously, I think in every industry, it's a really good question. How do you deal with that? And there's a good number of farmers where the best answer is, it's mine. I'm not going to give you anything. Whatever you're trying to sell, I don't want any. And I haven't even started with maybe regulatory concerns. So, my experience and what I'm really working on is nutrient management, fertilizers, nitrogen, phosphorus. So there's this economic aspect with an environmental aspect. So when we put too much on, it's polluting. And I think this is another place where to date, I don't think there's been anything, because there's no model good enough to confidently say more or less the use efficiency of a crop for a particular fertilizer, or how well did a farmer do at fertilizing. I think a lot of farmers kind of see the day coming where there is such a thing, and they might be punished or fined because they're putting on too much fertilizer because their township doesn't want them to do that. And that's going to bring up a lot of interesting conversations, because who gets to make that decision between the economics, the environmental, and then ultimately the societal decisions? When I always say farmers don't farm to pollute. Farmers farm to produce food and earn a living. And who eats that food? If there's some tax to be paid, or if you're saying farmers have to apply less because it's hurting everybody, well, I think we have to all come to the table and say, well, what are they actually producing, and how are we going to pay the farmer to do that, to make that decision, to make the decision to apply less, knowing that's going to hurt their yields and profit. Yeah, that's a good question, though. I'll stop there.
So it's almost like your answers are leading onto the next question, because I had a question here, and the question is, you know, in the future, like with your startup, what do you think would prompt a farmer to call insights sensing? Is it like a drop in this year's yield versus last year's yield, or is it just like a management decision saying we need to reduce the cost of fertilizer by 30% this year for our farm to be able to survive like the next 2 years? Or is it like a regulatory concern, like defined because you know the regulatory bodies are checking for pollutants in runoff water and that kind of thing? Do you see it as a mix of these three things, or do you see one being like a primary driver and then the other things being, good to solve with your solution?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. What does the farmer come into us for? And ultimately, especially in potato, potato is a high value crop where, frankly, the cost of fertilizer is so cheap that if economics were the only concern, they'd put on twice as much as the crop needs. There's some quality concerns at certain times of the season. Those are details that don't really matter for this, but if it was only economics, they would just put on a lot of fertilizer. They are being regulated in certain places. I mean, especially, there's some general rules, but the rules that are out there are more or less, they're difficult to enforce because of data privacy and things like that. But now, with that said, I'll say what you said in my last answer: farmers don't farm to pollute. So they have really no interest in applying twice as much as they need. But there's some level of risk tolerance for a farmer in, where they're going to be comfortable shorting themselves, if you will. How far back can I go without affecting my yield? Being a high value crop, if you're losing any yield, that means you messed up. So why are farmers coming to us? First, nitrogen management programs, especially in potato operations, but corn and wheat as well, they cause the most stress for farmers. If you ask, like, it'll be a top 3 thing throughout the year. Weather, seed decisions, and nitrogen are generally and maybe markets. There'd be the four things that farmers worry about. It's because we don't know a whole lot about nitrogen and how it behaves in soil. As much as we know, I mean, I could talk for hours and hours about the nitrogen cycle and bore you to death with that. But it comes down to, we're not able to really measure what's there very well. And we know nitrogen, especially compared to other nutrients, it varies over space and time. So these things that we're trying to address with precision agriculture, it's always changing. It generally moves with the water. If we get a 2-inch rain event, a lot of the nitrogen flushes through into the groundwater. Depending on the time of the year, there's a few different examples of what nitrogen does. And in a potato farmer's case, they're generally employing, if they're a larger operation, they're employing a few people during the summer months to drive around and collect these tissue samples, which just takes a lot of time. It's kind of a tedious job. I mean, you walk into the field, you take a petiole sample, you go to another part, and you might take 20 petiole samples around the perimeter of the field, and that might take 30 or 40 minutes. Well, you work a whole day and you only got to 15 fields, but the potato farmer has 100 fields. So like it's more than a full-time job to do this. And by the way, when they send those petiole samples into the lab, they put all 20 together into a composite sample and get one number for it. So any spatial variability, we're at the spatial scale of field to field. we're just collecting, farmers are collecting 20 samples just to get a representative. But, we see this, representative isn't necessarily how we should be managing, because there are lows and there are highs, and representative might only, I hope this makes sense, representative only might make up 10 or 20% of the area of that field. The other 60% is either low or high. And so why are we farming more than half of the field based on this composite sample? Farmers understand that. They are not satisfied with existing solutions, but they don't really have anything else. Peace of mind is another reason farmers are coming to us. So sometimes, different farmers have different management strategies. Some of them will go to what they consider a representative area, and to speed up sampling time, just go to one area of the field, take their samples from there. Being able to predict the nitrate levels across the field kind of gives the farmer confirmation if they're sampling in the right spot. When we can do these summary statistics on the whole field and compare it to where they took their sample from, they might want to be sampling in a different area. And I think ultimately the goal is to do away with sampling if they have another tool to trust. But here comes into play this whole trust issue, and being able to trust some AI model. Why in the world would I trust that? Over a method that's really worked well for me for the last 3 decades.
As you were speaking, I'm even beginning, I know for sure when I'm at the grocery store looking at potatoes, I'm going to have more appreciation for them. I'm even thinking, just tasting potatoes, they might taste a little bit better just from realizing how much work goes into producing potatoes. So that was awesome. Any other questions? All right. So Tyler, on behalf of our Meetup and our members, I want to say thank you so much for presenting this evening, and thank you so much for educating us. I know besides the AI component, I'm getting a much better appreciation on how food is produced, and I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing for all of us to appreciate how food is produced. And
yeah, I think so too. And I think it touches on what I trying to communicate with that social aspect. It's, agriculture is anybody that eats is impacted by agriculture. And in the last generation or so, last couple generations, we're generally seeing the shift of people away from their food. And I think it's our society, this is my opinion, will be better off if we stay close to our food and know how it's produced, even when it's mass produced. There's reasons we do that. It's because we have a lot of people. And food is great.
Yes.
We all like it.
Yeah. What's the joke that goes around is, you ask kids nowadays, where does milk come from? Some of them won't say a cow. They'll say from, Cub Foods or Jerry's. So I'm with you on just appreciating where our food comes from and the effort that goes into producing food. So thank you so much for that. Yeah.
They might say that your milk comes from soybeans now.
Or almonds.
Almonds. Yeah.
Yeah, they don't like those commercials. My family and people back home, the almond milk commercials. They don't like them, and it's kind of taken away from dairy and redefining what milk actually is.
Any other comments from the folks online here? All right. Well, Tyler, thank you so much, and everybody else here, thank you for attending, and have an awesome weekend and holiday. So 3-day weekend coming up. So good weather. That's gonna be nice. Awesome. Thank you, everyone.
And thank you guys again.
Everyone.
Thank you for your attention. I
Awesome.
really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks. A lot of fun.
All right. Bye-bye.